And don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you loyal listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, October 8th, 2022. We begin with our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka, riding the waves of history, giving us the historical drumbeat calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, Dr. Gerald Horne will be in conversation with Professor Terry Ann Scott, Professor of History at Hood College in Frederick, Maryland, and Director of the Institute of Common Power. For our purposes today, Professor Scott is the author of the book, Lynching and Leisure, Race and the Transformation of Mob Violence in Texas. And these two historians will be diving into the American history and culture of lynching throughout the U.S. with a focus on Texas. This will be a discussion that will truly contextualize the mentality and barbaric nature of the countless participants in these acts of terrorism, so stay tuned. Then, in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from J. Brent Morris, Professor of History at Clemson University in South Carolina and author of the book Dismal Freedom, A History of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp. The history of the Maroons throughout the West's history of slavery is one of rebellion and fight for freedom. However, many of us don't know who they were and why they are so significant in our history. Professor Morris is here to answer these questions and more about these self-liberated African peoples throughout the Western Hemisphere. It's all right here on Freedom Now. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and still able to bring you this much quality content, we want to remind you to call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org and pledge your support to the station at any level. Remember, these are all tax-deductible donations, and you can become a member for just $25 and help keep Freedom Now to stay on the air to bring you this type of quality programming. So hop on that phone line and call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, and make your pledge today for $25. $50, or maybe even $100 or more to support our efforts here at Freedom Now. Now I'm gonna be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring John Coltrane, Dexter Gordon, David Murray, Arthur Blythe, and Joe Henderson. Now people get ready for this train a-comin', taking you one step closer to mental liberation. And stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum and a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Terry Ann Scott.
Molweni Ekaya, Jarastafari, Hotep. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with our weekly African drumbeat historical calendar here on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, the first day of our fall fund drive. We bring you this calendar to emphasize that every day should be Black History Day rather than on the shortest month of the year, once a year, February. We are making prior calendars from Freedom Now available to the listening audience as a premium for $50. You get a wonderful gift, which is the chronological collection of 1 year of the African drumbeat historical calendars with reggae dub beats as a bottom to add to your educational CD collection. You can cruise and learn your history as well as pass it on to your children. This calendar is Pan-Africanist and internationalist, which highlights the victories and struggles of all oppressed people with an emphasis on women's contribution to world history. Please call us at 818-985-5735 or 818-985-KPFK. For a $50 contribution, you will assure continuance of Freedom Now, of which there is no other comparable program on all 24 radio stations on the AM and FM dial. October 10th, 1911. The Wuchaga Uprising marks the beginning of the Chinese Revolution, whereby China, the poorest country in the world, under the leadership of the student cadre from the University of Peking and Chairman Mao Zedong, organized the Chinese Communist Party. This party eliminated poverty, disease, and illiteracy, and today, the Chinese Communist Party controls the fastest growing economy in the world. October 10th, 1873. Teresa Urrea, who is considered the Mexican Joan of Arc, was born. She was a mystic, curandera, and gave her blessings, leadership, and spiritual powers to the Indian revolts over illegal land acquisition and oppression by the Spanish-Mexican elites. October 11th, 1979. Sandra Smith, a revolutionary African in the United States, was assassinated by the Ku Klux Klan in 1979. She had organized an anti-Klan rally in Greensboro, North Carolina, as the student body president of Bennett College. October 12, 1974. The anti-Christopher Columbus International Day of Solidarity with the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere was born. This revolutionary action is critical to negate the racist Eurocentric worldview that until a white man comes into your land, you have no history or existence. October 14th, Aisha was born. She was married to the Prophet Muhammad. She became famous for her courage, intelligence, and resistance to the subordinate status of Arab women. She was a leading figure in Islam. October 15th, 1935, Maria Teresa Mirabal was born. She was the youngest of 3 Dominican Republican sisters who resisted the pro-U.S. fascist Trujillo dictatorship. All 3 sisters were executed on November 15, 1960, by the government. October 15, 1987, the revolutionary Pan-Africanist Tom Sankara of Burkina Faso in West Africa is assassinated after a French-backed military coup. October 16, 1968, the Black Power salute is given at the World Olympics in Mexico by gold medal winners John Carlos and Tommy Smith, thereby demonstrating to the world African resistance to United States racism. October 16, 1891, Sarah Winnamucca was a female Paiute leader and outspoken activist against the United States government treatment of Native Americans. When she was born, her people were thriving in Nevada, but were then forced to relocate twice from a Reno reservation in 1860 to Oregon, and then brutally moved once again under starvation conditions to Washington State. She went on a campaign to expose the injustice against her people facing violence and land developers. Once again, we ask you to please call 818-985-KPFK, 818-985-5735, where you can obtain a wonderful gift of all the historical calendars of the past year for a $50 contribution, which helps assure the continuance of Freedom Now and KPFK. So please call and support KPFK with a pledge of $50 at 818-985-KPFK. We will close out this section of our program with our unity chant of power to the people from Azania. Please say Amandla and the response Awetu. Amandla Awetu. Amandla Awetu. Amandla Awetu.
The historical calendar is such a great tradition and reminder of the importance of Freedom Now here on KPFK, and we need your support to keep that tradition alive. Call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate and pledge your support, and you can bring home some great wisdom for your book show. That's right. Call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now. I now send you over to Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined by Professor Terry Ann Scott. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org. And with me on the line is Terry Ann Scott, Professor of History and Director of the Institute of Common Power at Hood College, author of the book Lynching and Leisure, Race and the Transformation of Mob Violence in Texas. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Scott.
Thank you so much for having me. And just a quick edit, the Institute for Common Power is not associated with Hood College.
Oh.
I have both positions at once.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Excuse
no,
me.
that's okay.
So why did you write this book, Lynching and Leisure?
The question and the fact that you are having me on the show to highlight this type of racialized violence. I have been teaching African American history for the past 20 years. I have only wanted to be a professor since I was 15 because I thought teaching African American, we can somehow begin to dismantle some of the racism that creates structural inequality, that creates fear and creates the devaluation of Black lives. And so while I was doing one of the history projects, public history project in Dallas, Texas, during my master's degree program, a picture came into the archives at the Dallas Public Library. It was a picture of the burning of George Henson. He had been burned in Corsicana, Texas in 1901 in front of 5,000 unmasked people looking at the camera. And I thought to myself, how did they arrive at that? How in this country was this a thing? That they are not, they have no fear of punishment, that they are standing in broad daylight, that they are proud of what they have done to this young Black man. And that is what set me on the journey to discover the different nuances and contours of lynching in this country.
Now, given the lynching of Mexican Americans, indigenous, and people of African descent, was Texas the national leader in lynching?
It was not the national leader, but what my research has demonstrated is that Texas was actually third in its ranking. And so it was quite high up there behind Alabama and Georgia.
Now, in this pre-radio, pre-television era, I infer from your book that attendance at lynchings was a kind of entertainment for many of the Euro-Americans assembled. Was that a fair inference?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I sought to do in this book was not only write a comprehensive analysis of lynching, because there is not one that narratives on lynching talk about a particular or a small group of them or one portion of the state. So not only did I want to chronicle lynching, I wanted to look at how it fit in the same discourse as leisure. And that was very easy to find because it was considered a recreational thing in various ways. When you think about what is leisure, scholars agree that it requires three things: that it is self-directed, that a person derives pleasure from it, and that it is done on their own time, away from work. And so all of those things fit into how many people experienced the lynching of the Black people in Texas.
Now, you mentioned burning lynch victims in Texas. Was burning victims in oil common in Texas?
So they burned them, yes, it was very common. They would use oil at the bottom of whatever debris or wood that they would use and put the live person. Very rarely was the person already deceased when they burned them. Typically, the mode of death was the burning, and then they would burn individuals. And this really, I spent an entire chapter on the book in this, because one of the things it demonstrates to us is exactly who is in charge. There was not a legal process that would come and stop these people from doing this to an individual. It was the lynchers who were in charge. It takes time to create a funeral pyre to burn people. It takes time to burn a person, wait for the person to cool, to dig through the ashes, to remove souvenirs. This was a half-day event, and nobody stopped the people from engaging in this event. And so the burning demonstrates many things. It demonstrates the absolute destruction of the Black body. It demonstrates that the crowd was in charge. It demonstrates that there was no fear of punishment.
Now, I take it that Black men were disproportionately represented as lynch victims, but having said that, were Black women and children also lynched?
So Black men definitely disproportionately represented were several Black male teenagers. It was a young girl named Hannah, who was only 12 years old when she was burned to death through lynching. And there are only a few women who were burned in the state of Texas. And so by and large, it was primarily Black men and Black teenagers. There are a large number of teens, 16, 17, 18 years old who were burned. Or who are lynched, rather.
Do you see any parallels between lynchings and bullfights?
Well, the interesting thing about lynching and bullfights is that at one point in Texas, and I write about this in the book, there was a group of individuals who wanted to stop bullfighting in the state because they said it was just too violent. And one of the things that some of the newspaper writers who actually wrote out against lynching said is, bullfighting, look at the irony of this. Bullfighting is too violent, and yet people remain silent. These same groups of people remain silent when we're talking about the lynching of Black people. In that similar vein, we saw that with boxing. There was a group of white reverends in the late 1800s and 1890s who wanted to stop a very famous match from occurring in the state of Texas because they said boxing is just too immoral, it is too violent. And it was actually a group of Black pastors in the Galveston area who held a conference and admonished those white reverends and said, how dare you speak out against boxing and say nothing about the lynching of Black people in this state.
So what were the connections between the building of railroads and the adjunct of tourism to lynching?
So one of the chapters in my book is about touring lynching sites and how people would go to the sites of lynching after the lynching occurred to tour the space where it happened, or that they would go just before it occurred when they would hear it on telegraph, or they would know word of mouth that it was going to happen, because often these were planned events. And so railroads would often run special excursion trains to the sites of lynching. And so in several instances, I write about the odd coupling of having the individual who was on the train headed to the space of his lynching, riding in these same rail cars. Dudley Morgan is a person who comes to mind, for instance, with this. He had to sit in the same rail cars with the individuals who were riding forth in his rail car to watch him be lynched. Now, the railroad companies would eventually lament the invention of the car because they would say that cut in to their lynching industry.
How did that cut into? I don't get. How did that cut into their lynching?
Because people would take cars now to the sites of lynching instead of having to take the train.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. In some instances, in Sherman, Texas, for instance, there was a lynching, and the newspapers talked about how people were using their Sunday holiday to go on tours of these lynching sites, how the Sunday after the lynching, the roads to Sherman were filled with cars trying to come into the city to visit those spaces.
Now, given the theme of your book, is it fair for the reader to infer that with the rise of radio in particular and record players, that helped to divert the energy that had gone into seeing lynching as entertainment to these other areas?
I think the two can coexist. I don't think, because in the 1920s you have such a high number of lynchings, and you have the radio that exists just after or just at the late portion of the 1920s, and lynchings continue into the 1930s. If anything, in some instances, or the phonograph that exists at the same time as lynchings. There were phonographic renderings of some of the lynching victims and what had happened to them, and they would be played in places as far as Seattle, Washington. And so instead of cutting into the industry, they coexisted with it, and in some instances bolstered it.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about today, or looking at the broad sweep of the 20th century? It's probably fair to suggest that lynchings have declined in the 20th century as it proceeded, but did it just move into another sector? That is to say, police killings, were they somehow a substitute for lynchings? Think of George Floyd or Michael Brown et al.
No question. So in my book, Lynching and Leisure, the epilogue is about modern lynchings. And I mentioned that lynching is not a relic of the Jim Crow past. It is a modern form of racial violence. And so while you don't have the spectacle lynchings now, where you have 5,000 people gathering in a space, the police killings of these individuals definitely fall in line with the definition of lynching, and are in many instances lynchings. I talk about George Floyd, for instance, and Elijah McClain in my epilogue to the book. And so when you look at how lynching has historically been defined, there was a conference in the 1940s, 1941 at Tuskegee Institute, where Tuskegee, the NAACP, and other anti-lynching organizations and individuals came together. And they said, how do we have a consensus definition of lynching? They agreed upon was that it had to be 3 people or more. The people who were engaging in the violence had to assume that they were doing it in service to community or race. It had to have the outcome of a dead body, and there had to be a lack of due process. Now, your audience knows how many police killings fall into that definition.
Finally, Terry Ann Scott, author of the book Lynching and Leisure, Race and the Transformation of Mob Violence in Texas, a compound question. What are you working on now, and what is your advice to younger scholars who would like to walk in your footsteps in the 21st century?
Well, any younger scholars who want to walk in my footsteps, that's a lovely comment. So first, I appreciate it, and I'm always willing to, if they want to contact me, help any scholars or individuals who are doing research or have any questions. Currently, as the director of the Institute for Common Power, I am editing with my colleagues there and other scholars a volume on voting. And so we're trying to create a volume that the first half discusses race and voter suppression, and the second half discusses the civil rights movement, voter suppression today, and what we can do on our path forward. Because at the Institute and at Common Power, we function in voting justice. And so that's what we're trying to teach people, so that they understand the past, so they can move into a better future where we have a more inclusive democracy. So that's my current passion right now.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Terry Ann Scott, professor of history at Hood College, and as noted, director of the Institute of Common Power, author of the book Lynching and Leisure, Race and the Transformation of Mob Violence in Texas. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for having me.
Special thanks to Professor Scott for sharing her hard-earned knowledge with us. Where else can you get such quality content, context, and historical perspective other than Freedom Now? Call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show by donating today. And you can get one of our awesome premiums to expand your library and your mind. Dr. Horne, tell the people about what they can take home today.
Donate $100 and receive a signed copy of Gerald Horne's latest book, hot off the presses, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Fascism, which may be around the corner in the United States, is a combination of both slavery and Jim Crow, and is presently creeping into North America on little cat feet, with Texas in the vanguard. In order to be defeated, it must be understood. In order to be understood, this book must be consulted. Why is it that so many Black people in California have roots in Texas, including the first Black mayor, Tom Bradley, the first Black mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, the entertainer and actor and singer, Jamie Foxx? Read this book if you have roots in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma. Where else but on Freedom Now can you not only find out about fascism, but find out about Black American fraternities and sororities like the Omegas and the Alphas and the Deltas. Be the first on your block, in your school, in your church, in your fraternity or sorority that has a copy of the Counter-Revolution of 1836. Understand why it was that it was Texas that led the war against Mexico, which led to the United States seizing California in the first place. Why is Texas in the vanguard of cracking down on so-called critical race theory, cracking down on women's reproductive freedom, cracking down on the population of Mexican descent? Why does Texas have the largest Black population in the United States? Where else but Freedom Now can you get serious historical analysis of the LAPD or serious analysis of Black fraternities and sororities? Pick up the phone and dial
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735.
Donate $100 and receive a signed copy of the Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. And folks, there you have it. Call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now and make your support for the show and the station felt. Now, we're going to keep this train moving and send you off to Dr. Horne, who's going to be joined on the line by J. Brent Morris, right here on Freedom Now.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is J. Brent Morris, professor of history at Clemson University in South Carolina, and author of the book Dismal Freedom, A History of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, J. Brent Morris.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Horne.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
Oh, there's so many reasons, but probably the best answer I can give you is I was once upon a time a young law student who was distracted by history over and over and over, and came across a book when I should have been studying for my law school exams that had in it a picture of George Washington up a tree with a bear, a black bear at the base of the tree, and it was in the Great Dismal Swamp. And this sort of captured my imagination. I did a little bit more reading, and the little bit that I could find about the Great Dismal Swamp told me that there was a colony of fugitive slaves. It was always the way that it was described, and that just fascinated me, that in the middle of this huge slave society might be a pocket of freedom. And I immediately set off to leave law school and write an admissions exam or essay for graduate schools to study this. And got to grad school and realized very quickly that I just didn't have the skills to find people yet whose whole life mission was to remain hidden. So I put the project to the side and went on some other totally unrelated book projects, but kept coming back to the Great Dismal Swamp. And I was lucky enough to interact with some folks who were also interested in the swamp, especially some archaeologists. And it was through them really that I got pulled back to the swamp. Was able to clear some time to do some more research, get the writing done, and also use that archaeological evidence to fill in some gaps in the historical record that I had identified. So I got into the project really ambitiously early on, and it took me about 2 decades to really build the skills to find Maroons, write about them, and really get their story right, I think. And this is a book that I think is probably the most interesting and the best story I'll ever have a chance to tell. And I really hated to finish the book just because I love doing the work of it so much. But it tells the story of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp. And a Maroon is someone who has self-extricated themselves from enslavement or their children and settled in opposition to the laws of the society that would enslave them. And very often, Maroons would join up with other Maroons and form communities sort of outside of the reach of their enslavers. And it's just a fascinating story of a world that they built in a 2,000 square mile swamp with a cultural life of their own, with a society that I call a society in dismal freedom, but better than the best day of enslavement.
So 2,000 square miles alongst the North Carolina-Virginia border. You suggest that the population estimates range from 2,000 to 40,000, although the latter seems a tad inflated, as you suggest. But this question of Maroons was not unique to North America. There were Jamaican Maroons, There was Palmares in Brazil. Of course, there were likely Maroons in Florida as well. What do you see as the similarities and differences between the Maroons you study and these other cases of Maroons? That is to say, Africans who, as you put it, extricated themselves from enslavement and started independent communities in the belly of the beast.
Absolutely. The population numbers are a fascinating fact that I never could actually pinpoint. I think Frederick Douglass said it the best when he said, the numbers in the Dismal Swamp are hard to come by. All the other numbers are from outside white observers. And over the course of 200 years, my estimate is probably thousands of people lived in communities. And it's really hard to tell. You can't base it on runaway ads that people post. It's really hard to get at. It's not as easy to get at as other Maroon societies that you mentioned. Everywhere that there was slavery on any significant scale, there was marronage. And I actually define marronage as not just settling and creating of communities of people of like situations, but as a process, the process of extricating oneself from slavery. From the day that person sets foot off of the owner's land to the point where, wherever they end up, in a community, in a free state, recaptured, whatever. So it's a process. But marronage existed everywhere there was slavery. And I've learned a great deal about the Great Dismal Swamp from studying other Maroon societies and other geographic locations. The best examples are the biggest, probably, that left the heaviest paper trail, those in the Caribbean and South America. The Palmares in Brazil and the Jamaican Maroons just waged constant warfare against the colonial authorities and, of course, left a heavy paper trail because of that. And I found enough similarities in what I know of those Maroons with the Great Dismal Swamp to allow me to sort of use the experience of other Maroons, extrapolate from what I know of them to fill in some gaps at the Great Dismal Swamp. One of the things that I did know, and one of the reasons that not too many people have picked up on this story, scholars especially, who just don't have the time to put 2 decades into a book like this, but the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons, as other Maroons did, but even to a greater extent, tried above all else to remain below the radar. There were sometimes raids from the swamp against the outside society, but more often than not, more Maroons in the Great Dismal Swamp just wanted to reach a place where they could isolate themselves, sort of go into exile and no longer be a part of the society that surrounded them. And they had no interest in making war on their enslavers. So they left a very thin paper trail, and the few sources that I've ever been able to come across, I mean, it's less than a dozen of direct interviews with former Maroons or folks at the end of their lives in the late 19th centuries that give you a glimpse of inside of the Great Dismal Swamp Maroon communities. But their motivations, the cultures that they came from, a lot of behaviors and cultural beliefs. There's a lot of parallels in the Great Dismal Swamp that I've been able to discover with other Maroon societies. And without those other Maroon societies, it'd be very difficult to tell the tale of the Great Dismal Swamp. It's one of those things that I went into it knowing I would never know the full story. Any source that I could stumble across was a treasure. And it's other Maroon societies, other slave societies, archaeology that allows me to piece together a full story, or at least as full as I was able to do for this. So it's a hemispheric phenomenon, marronage was, and I think it's one of the best examples of the resistance of the formerly enslaved to their enslavers.
Now, speaking of the enslavers, I noticed that some of those enslavers used the phrase "drain the swamp." And I read that, I thought immediately of contemporary U.S. politics. But in any case, one of the musicians whose artistry we feature on Freedom Now, speaking of Max Roach, the percussionist, late percussionist, had roots in the Great Dismal Swamp, as I understand it. Do you know of any other notable Black Americans, descendants from that era?
I came across a few references of some family background of Ella Baker in there, but I don't really know the details of that story. But what's really fascinating, and a window that I couldn't fully open, was what you might call a Dismal Swamp diaspora after the Civil War. There were thousands of people that made lives in the swamp, and finding folks who had been Maroons after the Civil War is very difficult. We know they were in the swamp, and we know that most people left the swamp after the war was over. But they might have, gone far back to where they might have been formerly enslaved. They might have settled right outside the borders of the swamp, and it's difficult to actually trace people back to the Great Dismal Swamp. Although in some fascinating instances I was able to. Instances where people who left the swamp after the Civil War looked around, didn't see what they liked, and went back into the swamp to live out the rest of their lives in the only ways that they had known. I mean, people were born and died in the Great Dismal Swamp without ever seeing a white face, without ever stepping foot on dry ground. And it was like I say several times, a type of freedom that may not have been ideal, but it was, it was freedom relative on a broad scale of freedom and unfreedom. It was something that people chose rather than to continue to be enslaved. That phrase "drain the swamp," though, that you mentioned right at the beginning. It's funny because people tried to drain the swamp, the Dismal Swamp, for generations. George Washington was heavily invested in a company called the Great Dismal Swamp Land Company. And his plan was to drain the Dismal Swamp and make a fortune. And just like it had frustrated enslavers who tried to reclaim their fugitive property, it frustrated George Washington, and the Great Dismal Swamp Land Company never really amounted to much at all. I mean, the swamp was something that could not be beaten. I mean, it was drained in the 19th century to some extent, but it was the perfect refuge for people who were seeking freedom and to be just left alone.
Now, speaking of which, let me add the footnote for listeners who may not be familiar. Ella Baker was a stalwart of the 20th century, a founder of Dr. King's organization, as well as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and an activist of the first rank, which brings us to Colonel Harry Washington. Who was he?
Oh, Colonel Harry Washington. One of I can't say the most fascinating person that I came across in this research because there were so many, but Harry Washington was a man who had been enslaved by George Washington, had taken or been given the name Washington by his enslaver, the father of our country, and worked for a time at Mount Vernon. But Harry Washington was also somebody who George Washington had contributed as his payment, I guess, as a shareholder of the Great Dismal Swamp Land Company to go and work the swamp. And Harry Washington was sent to the Great Dismal Swamp to do all sorts of different jobs. There was an attempt to drain the swamp or several, processes to drain the swamp that never really amounted to much, but attempts to grow some rice in the swamp, to cut canals through the swamp, cut down trees and make barrel staves and shingles. All of these things were jobs that were tasks that were given to enslaved people that were owned by the shareholders of the Great Dismal Swamp Land Company. Harry Washington escaped and joined up with the British in the American Revolution, and took the opportunity to take up arms against his former enslaver, and was given sort of the honorific title Colonel Harry Washington by the people that followed him. And was able to leave the area of the United States after the war was over for a life of freedom. So many people like Harry Washington existed. There were folks who marooned in the Great Dismal Swamp and renamed themselves. There was a fascinating man named Jack Dismal who had a wife named Venus, who shows up in probably a half dozen fugitive slave ads over the years. I mean, he was constantly escaping and being recaptured and fleeing back to the swamp, and eventually he disappears. And I like to think that he finally made it, and his enslavers gave up on trying to reclaim him. But Harry Washington was just one of probably dozens of Maroons from the swamp that came out and participated in one way or another in the American Revolution. I believe Dismal Swamp Maroons probably flocked to Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775 there to fight for the crown. To fight against those that had enslaved them. And military service was a tradition that had deep roots in the Great Dismal Swamp. So not just the American Revolution, the War of 1812 very likely involved some folks who had Maroon backgrounds fighting, and especially the American Civil War, which started in 1861. As soon as it was evident that this was a war against slavery, and as soon as the theater of fighting made its way to North Carolina or Virginia around the swamp, dozens, probably hundreds of Dismal Swamp Maroons came out and participated on the side of freedom in one capacity or another.
Now, Colonel Harry Washington, did he wind up in Canada or West Africa?
I believe he ended up in Canada. Ended up on one of the ships that sailed out after the war. And we lose track of Harry Washington after a while, but yeah, Canada.
Okay. Now, you also tell the story of armed Africans in the Great Dismal Swamp, which was understandable since they were trying to resist being re-enslaved. And you also talk about the possible ties of the Nat Turner slave revolt in 1830s Virginia to the Great Dismal Swamp. Tell us about that story.
Well, Maroons in the Great Dismal Swamp were, I don't want to say heavily armed because weapons were really hard to come by. And if you had decided to settle in the depths of the Great Dismal Swamp, you're miles away from the edges of the swamp. And, if you have a weapon and it breaks, you can't very well fix it. So weapons were necessary for hunting, for survival in the swamp, and for defense. The connection to the Nat Turner insurrection is a fascinating one, though. There are sources that suggest that Nat Turner's father had self-extricated from slavery and gone to the Great Dismal Swamp. So I like to think that Nat Turner, grew up knowing that the Dismal Swamp was there, and no doubt he did, because where Nat Turner was enslaved was not that far from the Dismal Swamp itself. But in the lead up to the Turner raid, nobody saw that coming, but everybody knew that the Dismal Swamp was there. And for a century and a half by that point, the Great Dismal Swamp had served as a magnet of enslaved people seeking their freedom. And those population numbers that we discussed a little bit earlier, some of those numbers were based on what enslavers estimated to be the loss of slave property, the value. So the 40,000 population number is based on about $1.5 million worth of human property. But they knew the Dismal Swamp was there, and enslavers on the edges of the swamp, and really in the region in the southeast at large, feared the Dismal Swamp to no end because they had no idea how many people were in there. They assumed, as I think a lot of enslavers did, that the people that they enslaved were also fully human, and if they were enslaved, they would try to rebel and accomplish their freedom. So that's what they assumed their enslaved people were going to do as well. So the greatest nightmare to a lot of enslavers in the region was the Great Dismal Swamp. It was an army, highly armed, they believed, ready to strike out against slavery at a moment's notice. So in 1831, when the Nat Turner Rebellion broke out, initially, folks in the area assumed that it was the Maroon population of the Great Dismal Swamp, which had finally spilled out of the swamp to take their revenge on slave society. And it turns out to not necessarily have been the case. There were very likely some participants in Nat Turner's rebellion that did make their way into the swamp after the crackdown began and settled there. There's a legend of an enslaved woman and her child who made it to the swamp on the back of a mule that had once belonged to Nat Turner. Not sure how apocryphal that story is, but it's a nice one to include in the book as well. But the proximity of the Nat Turner Rebellion to the Great Dismal Swamp, like I said, made people think that the rebels were Dismal Swamp Maroons at first. And the attempt to try to capture them as they fled back to the swamp, which is what they assumed they were going to do, was extensive. Now, what follows was a crackdown on, or at least an attempted crackdown on marronage. Patrols were ramped up in the region around the Dismal Swamp. Laws were passed to curtail the ability of enslaved people to move at will around the region. But after Nat Turner, people never took their eyes off the Great Dismal Swamp. And, a generation later, when John Brown was planning his raid on Harper's Ferry, John Brown fully intended the Great Dismal Swamp to be one of the bases from which African Americans, formerly enslaved people, would strike, like you said, the belly of the beast, strike at slavery in the South. So it was, if only symbolically, a huge cloud, I guess, that hung over the heads of enslavers. And it was a magnet that inspired and drew enslaved people from the Southeast over a 2-century period.
So finally, J. Brent Morris, professor of history at Clemson University, author of the book Dismal Freedom, A History of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp. You've alluded in recent minutes to the fact that after slavery was abolished, some Africans decided to return to the Great Dismal Swamp. Talk to us about 2 points. What happens to the Great Dismal Swamp post-slavery? And secondly, are there Black people still living in the Great Dismal Swamp?
So what happens to the Great Dismal Swamp and its Maroon inhabitants after the Civil War is it's an interesting story, and one that I wasn't able to get as deep into as I would have liked. After the end of the war, most of the swamp's residents came out of the swamp, and no longer having any reason to try to stay below the radar or stay hidden, went about the business of piecing together families again and returning back to the places where their family roots might have been. There are instances of some really remarkable Maroon characters, which I detail in the book. Osman Hunter was a Maroon leader who was famously sketched in 1856 and published in Harper's Magazine. Osman Hunter settles right outside the borders of the Dismal Swamp, gets married, and has a family. Another Maroon family, which I documented in the book, lived a few blocks away from him. So tracking these people down in the census as best I can with, full names sometimes, but partial names others, it's difficult. But there were people who stuck around. I mean, this was a place where a lot of people who were enslaved were able to get into the swamp pretty easily. There is a continued sense of pride in the region, especially among the African American population, about the Great Dismal Swamp and what the Maroons represented. A sense of that heroism that the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons best represented. And there are still there's a lot of efforts now to tell that story. Folks who trace their lineage back to Dismal Swamp Maroons, or people who had been enslaved and work in the Dismal Swamp, are really bringing the story to light in ways that haven't been done previously. So I'm really looking forward to seeing some of these things come to fruition. And of course, the Great Dismal Swamp itself is now an official, is recognized by the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom as a stopping over point on the Underground Railroad. The Dismal Swamp has become a place that is still there. I mean, the swamp hasn't been fully drained. A lot of it has federal protection now, the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, and then the Dismal Swamp State Park in North Carolina. But it's still hard to get into. And when I was working with the archaeologist, it would take us hours to get a mile into the swamp to the dig site. It's used to this day for the training of Navy SEALs, for mercenaries from Blackwater to do some survival training in the swamp. It's still that inhospitable. And it's still a very wild place, and it's something special. I'll wrap it up with this. I mean, it's very special to go into the depths of the Dismal Swamp and sort of sit with that silence and sit with the knowledge of the history that unfolded within the boundaries of that swamp and the lives of the people that built, important lives and lives that mattered far away from slavery, on their own terms, in, as I call it in the book, dismal freedom, a type of freedom that was better than the best day of enslavement, a type of freedom that everybody that lived in the swamp chose on purpose.
So to the best of your knowledge, there are no more Black people living in the Great Dismal Swamp?
Probably not. There were occasionally in the 19th century, early 20th century newspaper articles that would surface of people who had hidden from the law in the swamp. But there are, I mean, the swamp has shrunk with drainage, and there are Black communities that live on the borders of the swamp who are getting to know the history that they've lived on for a long time. So it's fascinating to sort of be aware of people learning the history of the place that they currently live. But in the swamp, I don't believe there are any permanent residents.
Okay, so I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. J. Brent Morris, professor at Clemson University in South Carolina, author of the book Dismal Freedom. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
I went to St. Louis, Missouri the other day. They had Black Panthers from all over the country. No one knew about it at all. They had machine guns, recoilless rifles, grease guns, Lugers, 25 of them, all armed. And the chief of police met me at the airport when I arrived, and they were there, right there at the steps. He said, "You were violating the law." "Yeah, we're violating the law." He said, "We're tired of our white and black leaders, Jackie and Martin and Bobby, being killed. We're going to protect this man while he's here." And they didn't arrest one of them. Because they said if you arrest one, then someone's going to die, because we are ready to kill. Black power means black dignity. Just as surely as you're proud to be white, we're proud to be black. Black is beautiful, baby. It's pretty. I always say to my brothers, I say, "Baby, don't worry about the white chicks. We got everything from chalk to charcoal in our own race." You see? Black is beautiful. Black is beautiful. Black power means dignity. Means we're gonna walk side by side with you, or through you. We're gonna be with dignity and integrity. We don't want any more than you have, and we're not gonna accept any less than you have. That's black power.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guest, Professor Terry Ann Scott from Hood College in Maryland. Find yourself a Black-owned bookstore near you today and grab her book, Lynching and Leisure, Race and the Transformation of Mob Violence in Texas. Thank you to J. Brent Morris, Professor of History at Clemson University in South Carolina. And while you're in that bookstore, why not grab his book, Dismal Freedom, A History of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Many thanks to Prison Radio and Baba Mumia Abu Jamal for keeping us in the know from outside the walls of injustice. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone Baba Didan Kamati, as well as our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka for giving us the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week. Shout out to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. Please continue to support our programming. We are volunteer producers, and the station needs to be able to pay the bills to keep the lights on and the mics hot in the building. So please dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go to our audio archives on kpfk.org and scroll down to Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for a revolution.